Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
And already not follow Leslie's introduction, and that is, I'm going to take some liberties as part of the introduction and provide some background. The licensing unit really is broader than I think children, and so it really provides critical support to our most vulnerable populations, being certainly children who have experienced abuse and neglect, children who are in licensed child care homes when they can't be with their parents, as well as vulnerable adults who need an access to a continuum of support to support their safety and development. The work within the licensing unit really aligns with county board strategies around protecting and caring for our most vulnerable, as well as assuring a continuum of supports for vulnerable adults. So as we talk about and focus our work within licensing, it really is around looking at how do we license caregivers and providers who can provide safety and stability to individuals, vulnerable individuals, when they can't either live independently or be with their families. So licensors work to recruit providers, they work to license, support, and then retain really high quality providers. However, challenges within current workload have impacted the ability to really look at sort of strategic recruitment efforts because, as we'll get into, I'm sure, the increase in the child foster care world has significantly diminished our ability to do some program development and strategic recruitment. As I've talked here before in other Scott County Delivers, we've talked about the increase within child protection, for example, and that this is really a trickle down, that the licensing, as we see program expand in child protection or in developmental disabilities, it has a connection then to the impact within the licensing unit. How are we developing child foster care providers and adult foster care providers to help support vulnerable populations? So with that, we are seeing increases in the number of children entering foster care. The length of time children are staying in foster care is increasing. We are seeing an increase, certainly over the last several years, around relative foster care licensing. And I think that has two implications within the work, and that is they require to license relatives, which we know helps support good outcomes for kids. There's clear research on that, but it requires more time and intensity to help the relative walk through the licensing process. And it is there's faster turnover with relatives as compared to what we would call traditional foster care providers. So it has implications for workload. And then as well as we've got the expansion around the development of specific sites for the DD population. So as we've looked at increasing workload, we've also looked at what are some strategies to look at increasing some efficiencies. And that really resulted in a recent partnership with our GIS colleagues to look at how GIS might, in the child foster care world, provide some efficiencies around the locating of placements when placements are needed, as well as opportunities to look at some strategic planning for recruitment. So I'm going to take some liberties and say if we could do a 10 to 12-minute demo of some of the data that we've done within GIS as it relates to our child foster care. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
I'm going to hop up here. So in the GIS department, one of our goals is always to continue to connect and reconnect with businesses that we feel we can have some positive effect on. And we're really excited about working with Health and Human Services Department. We thought we would start off in the child welfare sector, which morphed into the foster care, and then kind of absorbed some of the adult foster care licensing as well. So when we first discussed things, sorry as I'm pulling things up here, when we were first discussing how we could go about using technology to help us out, kind of laid out about a couple different, three different use cases. One, helping the citizens directly, using technology to have them have visibility into assistance. So a lot of it here is focused at the county, so when people need assistance, it's really the government center here. But we also, a project we did last year, or a couple years ago, was actually building an application where residents can see where child care facilities are, just simple like daycare. So people can go on a map, see where the child care centers are, and then pull up their contact information, and also link to the Department of Health Services website where that shows their license information, contact information, and then things like if there's any infractions and stuff like that. So that was kind of at that base, like what the citizens can access directly. Talked about the next would be kind of for the caseworkers themselves. What can we do to provide them with more, to really dig into their information, their data, for the caseworkers, just like to mine for trends and patterns in the kids or adults that they're helping out. So in a world of unlimited budget and public will, that's kind of that proactive approach. But luckily with the technology, we can kind of cut down on some of that, and we can really help out there. And then what we're kind of going to be showing off today is that administrative level, which is really working on caseworker efficiency, and then kind of the management of the client data, just seeing where the children or the adults that need the resources are, and then where our resources are, and kind of how these things align. So the first part of this project was really coming up with the data. So when we started off, the data was the contact information for the facilities was located in the Outlook, like your email Outlook, just contacts there. It worked well, people were able to upkeep it, everyone had access to it, but it didn't really allow us to view the data on a map, didn't allow us to really connect the data anywhere, and then a lot of information was stored in notes. So it really didn't allow us to do, data wasn't uniform, so we couldn't do charts and graphs and all these graphics along with it. So we turned it from more of a qualitative data, like, oh, we know that the Petersons really like young kids, they're great with those. The Andersons, they're good with the teenagers, so if we have teenagers that need homes, we can send them over there. That's great, that's inherent data, we need that, but we also, for those that are coming into the county new employees, or we have people leave, we have to retain that somewhere, and then also just that ability to kind of take a holistic approach to that information. So our first phase was really taking the information we had and coming up with uniform fields, things that we can catalog. So we had location data, that's kind of the contact information, so we can actually turn these homes and these people into like a spot on a map. Their license information, which then we can use that to link to the Department of Health Services website. Parameters, so the data that we're going to actually use to find homes that meet the kids' needs. Like I said, we have that age group. If people have gender preferences, we can catalog that. So we have a field that says these people prefer boys, girls, or either. These people prefer kids in the age groups of 0 to 3, 4 to 7, 8 to 12, whatever it might be. And then we also had other information like dates. So we have effective dates, relicensing dates, so we can kind of see as a county how we're doing with recruitment, and retention of facilities. So now I'll actually kind of show some things off. So we're kind of in the very beginning stages of this data. So as we started working through it, we're finding that there's just always going to be data cleanup and data upkeep. And we're in the beginning stages, so we're going to show it off, kind of with the caveat that it's a process that we're working through, and we're kind of in the beginning. So we can see on our digital map here, so we went from pretty much like paper contact lists that got updated once a month, to now this is digital, now it's live, now we can visually see it. I'm assuming it's on your monitors up here. So right away at a glance, we can see where we have the adult, foster care centers, the child, and then those relative centers as well. What's great about having this now in a digital form is that we can also include other information with it to stack. That's kind of the power of GIS. The big one with the child care we were looking for was school districting. So to find when a child needs a new home, it's to their benefit to be within the same school district instead of bopping them all over the place. This kind of just allows us to see where the facilities are, in which school districts, so we kind of keep make that transition for them seamless. And this is just a great visual way, just boom, right away we can see who's available where. We also included layers such as parks and trails, if the kids like to play outside, oh, here's some great resources nearby. Just the more information we can add in, kind of the better for those kids, or in the future be those vulnerable adults, things like access to transportation, if they like to be near like a busy commercial area, like they like to go out, or for they like the more rural settings, we kind of have all that at a glance here. So I'll just quickly show. So before this was updated in, like I said, Outlook, people kind of were just able to type everything in freehand. Now with GIS, what we can do is now we have this web interface, which someone can go in, they can click on facility, and actually we can do all our editing in here. So what this is just really demonstrating is that now this information, the licensors can update this information pretty much as they need, as information comes into them. It's updated, it's live, so you can have multiple people editing this or updating this information, looking it up, overlaying it, wherever it is, and it's all live. It doesn't have to be just a printout that happens once a month, quarterly, whatever it might be. And then any systems that we have this information hooked up to, that's also live. It's just the benefits of turning something digital. I'll just show you some quick tools that we have in here. Just like I said, to demonstrate what happens when you turn something digital. Filter. So this is a great view. I shall turn these school districts off. This is a great view of just where we have all these facilities. But when we're looking for childcare, we want to see the open beds. Right away, boom, now we can see where we have some open beds. If we're only interested in childcare, we can filter that even further, and then if we were interested in just a specific school district, now we can say what's available in Belle Plaine. Now we can see, okay, we're down there pretty quick. Right? We can click on this, we can get this, let's say this is a traditional home, we can get their contact information, anything that has to do with capacity, occupancy information, which was not live before. So it's just, like I said, that was kind of that inherent information. Now we can access it. And then we can see here that these great individuals are willing to take kids of any age range. So very quickly. And we can also filter on that, as well.
So can I ask, in that case,
Yep.
that there was one person already, one foster child in that home already, and they could take one more?
So yeah, that's up. So that's kind of what we're talking about with the data. Now that we have the data in place, kind of like further mining it, making it useful. Yeah, because they already have somebody. So they can, like, actually, Suzanne, talk to this.
Yeah, so I think providers are licensed for a certain capacity, but also when we have children entering placement, we have an obligation to really be looking at what are the needs that the child is bringing forward, cultural, community-based needs, and so we have to look at, is the placement a good match? So even if there's capacity, it might not be based on the skill of the provider and or the needs of the child and family. It might not be the right match, but in this case, yeah, I think this home is licensed for 2. They may only have 1 based on their skill set and needs of children coming into care.
And if that is not a good match, then, and that's the only one, what do you do in that case?
Then we'd have to expand our
You gotta
search.
Move it up, okay.
Yeah. So, and maybe I'll just jump in. As part of our this recent GIS work, which I think is kind of exciting, we've also had a recent conversation with Dakota County to again look at, are there some partnerships to develop with neighboring counties? And so if in fact we moved into this pilot where we can share each other's GIS, and now I'm going to talk technical, but GIS database, then it enables us to potentially look at if we're placing or need a placement of a child in the Savage area, but we don't have any, what might they have based on the GIS that might have capacity that we could help call then Dakota and say, here does the Johnson family, would they be a good match? It would also involve or create the possibility of some partnerships around strategic recruitment based on sort of where populations of providers are or are not. So that's some future development that we're in conversations with Dakota.
Where do you house your data? And who updates the data? And do you have enough resources to stay on top of this all the time?
So as Tony mentioned, the data was really more paper and in Outlook through contacts and updated by workers. And so now it would just be updating it within the computer system.
Yeah.
So it's just changing where they're updating it versus are they providing it already? They're already providing it.
Is it possible to have maybe the providers be able to keep updated on open beds?
I think because we're involved in the placement process, we know who's placed in the home, so it's really not a difficult thing to maintain that. It's more, this was, like Tony talked about, this being at the start of putting this data into the GIS system. We were kind of building it as we went and kind of figuring that out. So there's pieces that we still need to work on. So I think that's the caveat, that we're early in that process.
There could be, Steve, some consideration moving forward around like the adult corporate world, because we don't have as much controls over who's coming in and out of those facilities as we do like in the child foster care world. And so maybe that would be a place to consider expanding down the road. Would a corporate provider be able to have access to update bed status over time?
All right, so I'll just show, like I said before, now we can filter on the data, now we can look up information. So if you know somebody's name, we're not just paging through, we can type in, start typing a name, go to their location. We can also see, oh, that might not have been a home. We also have linked in here the property information, so everybody's property information, so that when new people are applying to take on foster care, we can also just all the nice things about GIS, we can look them up as well through here. Actually, one thing we did want to showcase quickly was, now that we have, let me turn all my filters off. Like I mentioned before, we have those effective dates in there as well. So with this, let me zoom out. Actually, let me get in close. So we can see here that, I'm going to pull this out quick, sorry. So we have all of our effective dates over time. So this is actually going to show all of our facilities over time. So when they came about. So we can see that over the years. I'll just hit play here, and we'll see it's going to show at every year how many new facilities popped up. So you can see that in the early 2000s it was pretty sparse. 1 here, 2 here, 3, 4 there, and then we'll see as it gets later in the 2000s, we'll see like a good spike. And I believe there were maybe some laws in place or some guidelines in place that maybe prevented it. But then I believe as we get to 2016, let's get in there. We can see, there we go. Boom, we got like a nice spike in homes or in care centers. So it's just, like I said, it's another view into the data, seeing what we're doing right in those years, seeing maybe areas that we can improve. Now that this data is in a database, we can not only have it, so this is a homegrown application. We built this here based on our needs. We also have the ability to hook that up to other systems. This was, this is a vendor, a cloud solution that we already have as part of our GIS license. So they make this neat little dashboard that we can have charts and graphs and everything's linked together, so I can see, yeah, I only want to see, for the license stats, I want to see licensed. Now we can start to see our charts and graphs move all over the place. I only want to see child care, home child care, and boom, we can get really good looks at the information. We can see right away what our capacity is, open beds, number of facilities, and so on. And then here's kind of that look at that effective year as well. So it's just, now data's digital, now we can look at it in many different ways. And actually one of those ways is that the digital form on the web, and then we also produce some maps and graphics that people like to see that are portable, so we can include these in presentations now. So we just kind of like to show off all of our capabilities in GIS. This is us selling our services here. But yeah, we have these nice graphics we can put together. This is kind of showing the current state. Now, this is what we talked about earlier, when we have the data in place, and we're showing here that you might look at this and think, okay, this gauge here at the top, well, it looks like we have a lot of capacity. Well, like we saw earlier, we had a home that already had 1 child placed, it had 1 opening, that would show up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have, 85 great fits left for kids.
And we're, I think, just still finalizing data, so sort of the accuracy is still what we need to refine.
So really this is more exercise in demonstrating what we can do with the data now that we have it. And we also produce this one with the school districts. And what we want to stress, is kind of like those next steps of hooking up with Dakota County. We can see that these school districts cross county boundaries. So we're not just an island here, especially when dealing with these kids, kind of what's the best case for these kids? Does it, we might have great numbers here at Scott County, they do at Dakota County, and we want to bolster that, hey, look at how many great facilities we have, how many kids we have placed, but for the benefit of like the kids themselves, where's the best home? It might not be in Scott County. If they're in the Lakeville School District, it might be across the border. So those are kind of our next steps.
And then with that, we'll turn it over to the panel. So thanks for indulging us in our GIS work.
Related to this, do your staff have the ability to update, so as you get a
Control L.
new home, you don't need GIS to go in and enter it?
That's the hope. I think right now there's some technical glitches that are being worked out because of the new computers and what version of Internet Explorer or whatever that piece. But Tony is already on that and working on it. So.
The fun
that's the
components of
goal.
technology. Yeah.
So the intent would be that, yes, we would be able to, licensors would be able to update over time.
Okay.
Any questions? I'll ask a general question about the actual providers themselves. This would be page 6 and page 8. You show great results that 98% of the child care programs have had no negative actions, and then foster care, or the adult foster care programs, you have 97% of those providers with no negative actions against them. I was just wondering, how often do you look at the different providers? Is that something that's done on an annual basis? And do you touch every facility all the time there?
We do get out to see all of our providers on an annual basis. And then we also can receive concerns or complaints from the community. And so if that comes up, that is often a reason for another contact with them to kind of see if there are other concerns. And then we also partner with the state, especially in those adult programs, if it is a vulnerable adult report that's made to the state, they may evaluate it, do some assessment, and then pass that back to us to evaluate for licensing concerns.
It is great because it really shows that you are providing a safe area.
The one thing I would say is we've had a recent change, I believe, around the relicensing of corporate
We're still going to see them each year, but they just won't do all the
licensing. So you'll do the annual
so it's-
visits.
Yeah, and I think that being out and seeing them is a good thing. I think we work really hard to establish good relationships with all of our providers. All the workers, that's an important part of their job. They want to do that because that's when you have that working relationship, that they call you with they call you with questions or concerns before it gets to be a bigger issue, and hopefully we can either offer support, resources, other things that they might need.
And I think in some counties that might be approached really differently, especially in the childcare world, that the role could be viewed as sort of an enforcer around statute and rules and regulations. And yes, we hold that responsibility, but we also hold that relationship because as we coach and provide support, we are more apt to be, that provider's gonna call us with a question or a concern before acting, which could in fact then prevent, obviously, negative or corrective action issues.
I have a question on page 14. So from 2010, 2011 onward, there's a steady decline in the number of new and existing child care licenses in the county. Do you have any theories about what is behind that trend?
I think there probably are multiple factors that contribute to it. There are some folks who come into being a child care provider as a short-term, my children are younger, I'd like to be able to be home with them, and it's great if I can have some more kids do that. And there's also folks who have really looked at it as their professional career, and just like, they're baby boomers, and so they've kind of reached that age where they're looking at retirement. There were also some changes into the rules and regulations that probably started around 2014 that increased some training requirements and things, and that for some folks might have been the tipping point. And I think that also even looking a little earlier in the data, when the recession hit, there was an uptick in folks who wanted to be licensed because maybe their full-time employment changed and they were looking at that as a resource. And then if they weren't able to maintain their numbers to make it a lucrative business for them, then they also would close. So I think like all of those things contribute to that decline.
Can I ask a question about that or get a clarification? Is it true that, so we're talking about home child care providers. Now, Scott County, we don't license center providers, DHS does, is that correct?
That is correct. We just do the in-home providers.
So maybe another reason is I think over the last couple of years, we've seen more center-based providers open up in the county too. So I think important when we look at this, it's like, oh, we're not losing child care opportunities necessarily in numbers. We don't have that whole picture because we don't license them.
Correct.
Thank you.
I think one of the biggest challenges that stood out is the increasing placement and trying to keep up with the increasing number of options, foster care placement homes. What, you mentioned in your introduction, limited time to do that recruiting. What kinds of things are we doing for recruiting? And then also, are we working with other counties to find out things that are working for other counties that might help us, that kind of thing?
For recruitment, I think we haven't had a sustained big effort recently. We've tend to do kind of smaller bursts of things. We do have information on the county website, and we direct folks there to kind of get started. And there's a general foster care email that they can contact us if they'd like more information. And then we have every day someone's on coverage in the unit, and they respond to those. And we've done things like we've had a table at the county fair. We try to do articles in the scene.
Faith communities.
Outreach towards the faith communities, although that's another database to maintain. Those change, and we have to stay up on that to get that information out. Those are kind of the big ones I can think of.
In terms of your question, Jen, around like partnerships with other counties, I think GIS, again, provides some opportunities to do that more strategically around partnerships with other counties. Our material also referenced the Quality Parenting Initiative. Shortage of child foster care homes is really a statewide and nationwide issue. We are not alone in that. And Quality Parenting Initiative is around how are we sort of rebranding and redefining child foster care, so with the intent of looking at different strategies to better recruit and sustain high-quality providers. So I don't necessarily have answers to exactly what that will look like as a statewide initiative. We are joined in with that so that we can continue to be a partner in what will help bring additional high-quality child foster care providers to us, and then how do we retain them and support them through.
Down the same path of out-of-home placements, I just recall back in 2008 and 2009, we established the Signs of Safety program, and that really helped us to decrease the number of out-of-home placements. Are we still using that practice of that program, and also are there parts of it that we discontinued that we could bring back?
Yeah, no, good question. No, we still use the Signs of Safety practice model as our practice framework within Children's Services. I think a number of things. Signs of Safety is not about placement reduction. It had that impact 10 years ago. Certainly, we've got some different factors that are impacting service delivery. Parental substance use, opioid epidemic, that when we really look at our open cases and those children in placement, over half of those are young kids, 0 to 5, with parents' substance abuse. And so Signs of Safety is a practice framework about how we are really looking at engaging parents and extended family to help create safety, but inherently it's not a placement prevention. It is around an engagement of how do we look at alternatives to help create safety. But obviously when we're talking about really young, most vulnerable with parental substance use, then foster care certainly becomes a component to try to secure safety.
A question a little bit related to that, since Steve brought it up. So you have a good sense of sort of what, to me, one end of the spectrum, that increasing efficiencies, trying to up recruitment for out-of-home placement, where are you gonna put people? But can you give us briefly, to me, and I'm not that well informed, but to me, it's a little bit of treating the symptom and maybe not the root cause. So can you give us a sense of what's going on to address some of the root causes that would lead to so much out-of-home placement? Because I think having a picture of both of those ends of the spectrum would be helpful, at least to me.
So are you talking about what, like prevention efforts?
Yeah, how do we get to the point where we don't need to be finding so many more people to host and house the children who are being placed? How do we prevent placement from being a need in the first place? Not, we don't want to place people, because I understand that a lot of the times it's in the best interest of the child. But how can we as a community members, as public programs, get to the point where we're actually preventing the need for that whole discussion? Is there anything that's going on collaboratively in that area?
So there's certainly the county board strategy around preventing the need for child protection services. So we held community engagements late last fall, November. And so really are looking at what are those active strategies that can help get at that front end versus, well, I want to say versus, we need the front end and the back end. But it is looking at how do we look at expanding a continuum of parenting education and support, and certainly culturally specific, culturally responsive services. There was a parent at one of the community engagement sessions who talked around, she was from the Latino community, and the need for sort of multi-generational parenting support, because in their culture, the grandmas are active in child rearing, and their child rearing practices are really different, and they recognize that there are differences in child rearing put them at increased risk of coming into child protection. So it's how does child protection get out more with underrepresented communities to talk about both what parenting supports look like to them, as well as what are sort of child protection reporting standards and what would or could lead them into involvement. So I think it's more active engagement with some underrepresented communities. It's community-based parenting education support. Certainly we heard loud and clear affordable housing and some of those broader systemic issues that we've talked about previously.
Thank you.
Maybe along slide 8, the negative actions for child and adult foster care. Do you have a sense of how we compare to other counties on this? And it seems like our numbers are pretty low. I understand the denying the licenses, but just one really negative action in the last 2 years. Is that typical? Maybe if you could just speak more about what that means, these numbers mean to you.
Typical, I'm not sure that there is a typical, and I guess I haven't talked with some of my counterparts in other counties to kind of see where they're at. I think that we tend to, because of the requirements for the license, we tend to catch more of the things, and it's going to result in a denial on the front end, and that's going to be someone who had a pretty significant criminal background. The rules just say you can't do it. You can't pass go. We can't do that. I'd have to think about it. I don't remember exactly the revocation case, but that one, usually it's a pretty significant issue that happened. And so if it needed to be, then we went down the road of that negative action.
I have a question with page number 11, looking at the percentage of out-of-county child foster care. I see that we are, on an annual basis, increasing in the total placement requests, but going through that GIS data, it was showing how more commercial facilities are available or providers are available here in 2017 and 18. But it appears on this that the percentage that has to go out of county, though, has really increased. And I would think with having more facilities available, we would see more of a decline there instead?
I think a couple factors potentially impact that. One is use of relative foster care. So when we look at the GIS data, that are homes that we license. They're not specifically, though, only caring for Scott County children, because Ramsey County may have a grandma in Scott County, and so we are licensing her. when we're talking about out-of-county placement requests, these are Scott County youth or children that we are needing to find a resource because we don't have a current resource to meet their needs. So it isn't, we're not sort of comparing apples to apples, that the facility development might be around increase of relative placements or relative providers, but not necessarily to care for our kids.
Okay.
Slide 12, around the timely licensing of Scott County relative foster care providers. Do you have a sense of how many of those that are not meeting the required timeline are due to maybe not receiving information from those families to complete the license versus, I guess what I'm trying to get to is what's on our end where the workload is we're unable to make it versus what is because we're not receiving what we need to complete the application? Do you have a sense of, in those numbers, which is which?
I think that I think we do a good job of getting out. We get referrals either from our placing workers when they place with a relative or from other counties when they place with relative. And getting that like application started and all of that, I think we do a really good job. There are pieces that are the actual applicant's responsibility to complete around training, things they do to their home to make sure that it's safe, that we can try and work and follow up with them on, but they may not follow through on. And then there are also pieces that go along with the background check process, specifically because the background checks are completed by the state, and if that particular person has had an out-of-state address for more than 5 years, that is an identified issue with the net study system that that just takes longer because of all these, all these rules about what the other state needs and that. So we can try to get them to a certain point, do that. And then there are sometimes, kind of depending on what's going on for the children that are placed in their home, that the relatives may be the obstacle themselves. They may decide, well, no, I'm not going to continue with this. I'm not going through with this. I can't continue to care for this child in my home.
So it sounds like it's not necessarily an internal workload issue that we're not meeting that. It's external forces at play. Is that fair?
Well, I think
Overall quantity, I think there's that workload issue. I think we get out and kind of do that, but that there isn't any additional time to help them and support them and get them through the process.
Okay.
Yeah, when we look at really the data around the increase of relatives, we know that relatives take more time and intensity to handhold them through the sort of the paper process, the licensing process, which is complicated. And you're talking about relatives who have taken in individual or sibling groups, and sometimes they're already caring for the children, so helping them understand why they now need to go through this process when they're already caring. And then there's additional trainings that they have to get to. And so for us to be able to have the capacity to do the intensity of hand-holding and support is where we get compromised. So it's hard to say, is that on our end or on their end? It's just a complicated process for both, and we know to help relatives, it requires intensity on our part to help navigate them through the process, and that's where workload can become challenging.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Other questions? Steve? Yeah.
Any
Okay.
questions?
All right, does the audience have any questions? Claire?
Oh, Claire's there.
I'm wondering, when we were talking about relatives needing to be licensed, when relatives need to be licensed, I imagine that a lot of grandparents are currently watching the kids, and maybe mom went off to treatment or is gone, just kind of took off or whatever. How do you discover that? And is it really necessary to license them, or is it only necessary to license them if they want some compensation for caring for them?
If the agency, if a child protection intervenes because there's some concern for safety. So if grandparents are caring for kids and mom went on her own to treatment and there isn't a safety, we may never know about that. But if mom goes to treatment and then disappears, leaves treatment, and my grandma and grandpa haven't seen mom in weeks or months, then that might end up coming to us, because if kids are school age, they need appropriate authorizations. So if the agency ends up needing to intervene for safety, then that needs to become a placement, because then we are saying and intervening, saying child may or may not be able to return home to mom or mom or dad. So it really is about, is there a safety issue that requires the agency's involvement?
Another question I have, because it's kind of a hot issue at the legislature, is the criminal background checks for anyone 13 and over in-home childcare centers. It was a relatively new law. They're trying to rescind it. I'm just wondering if have you seen, as people are being checked for that, is that a common issue? Or is it a deterrent even to people who might want to be licensed?
Right now, we do background checks on the 13-year-olds and up. I think the current opposition is that it would change to a fingerprint-based background check, and the child care providers are concerned about that. I would have to look at my licensors, but I'm pretty sure that, you can have a teenager in the home who's got some possession charges and things that I think it's good that we know about. If we're going to have young children in that home, I think we'd want to know that they have that. There's a process they work through, and they have to request reconsideration for that disqualification, but I think that that's a safety issue that we'd want to have. My understanding, and things may have changed, I haven't been following the legislature extremely closely, but that we would still, the state would still do the background checks for those individuals in the homes. It just wouldn't be a fingerprint-based one until they turned 18.
And one last question. When you have adults, vulnerable adults who need care, when do you decide that they should go into adult foster care instead of, or could they go to assisted living or a nursing home? When is a placement in adult foster care most appropriate?
Yeah, so for a license, that really would be the case manager involved with that individual, looking at what are their placement needs and how best to secure sort of safety, stability for that individual in the least restrictive, most community-based setting. So from a licensing standpoint, we look at how do we provide a continuum of foster care resources. The placing worker, along with the individual and their extended family system, would help identify what kind of placement setting is most appropriate to meet the need.
Around the, quality parenting initiative, what do you see that bringing for us in the future? If kind of a forward thinking, how would this look differently with our child foster care providers a year from now?
You want to speak to that?
I'm not sure. I think a year is.
Well, certainly some of the efforts around QPI that we're already looking at internally that mirrors the statewide efforts is around how do we bring foster parents and birth parents together quickly within days of a placement. We know when we've got parents talking to each other as moms versus the system, that the relationship can build. We can see increased opportunities for parent to be with the child, to visit the child, and research would support that then the length of placement can decrease. And you can look at the potential that foster parent is involved as a support person after the child goes home. So it's building a broader network so that we could look at placements ending and that there's a safety network around that child and family that we've helped build. I think that's one piece. The other piece that we're looking at is really feedback from our providers around how did they see the level of support provided by the agency, and then for us to look at that data on an annual basis to really identify, are there sort of strategies to help increase supports to providers to help improve the outcomes for kids.
How do you manage that if it goes south? So if you're building this relationship between the birth parent and the foster care provider and then things aren't going well, how do you put controls in place so that they're not getting too involved or?
Yeah, the case manager would really have to help direct that. Certainly we're not going to bring foster parents and parents together if there's a safety concern, that really that is part of the licensor and placing worker sort of assessment.
Okay.
But we do know that it supports good outcomes when we can bring parents and foster parents together quickly. And so how to do that. Certainly QPI offers some structure to those sort of first meetings. And then are there roles around, eventually, if things go well, their role in supervised visits, which again can help increase capacity internally for us if we're using foster parents in some different ways.
A question about the relative foster care. You talked about the licensing and how it was different in terms of your staff interacting with a relative as opposed to a traditional, which sounded kind of like basically your motivation was different in terms of the licensing on the part of the parent. That the traditional saw themselves as needing to go through all of these steps in order to do something they wanted to do. Whereas a relative, it was more like, I have to do this, I don't understand why. But when you talk about one that are fully licensed now, what is the difference in how your staff have to support the parent, the foster parent, whether they're a relative or a non-relative? Is there a difference, and what does that do in terms of your staff capacity?
I think there can be a difference. Some of it is going to be around what's happening for the particular children that they're caring for, and if they're being asked to be a permanency resource for those children, are they understanding what that means? It's a lot of information, I think, for those relatives to take in, because there's whatever happened prior for that child or children to come into their home. And, you know, if it's grandma or grandma, that might be their own child that had some issue. And there's a lot of kind of emotional issues that brings up for them as a parent. And then now we've got these other children that need care. And, you know, is that something that they really think they can do? And usually that's within a time frame of 6 to 12 months of the children being in their care. They may be asked, can they be that permanency resource? We've made a lot of changes in their life by coming in. So helping them kind of through that, I think that the licensors are, you know, that really consistent person that they see the case manager and that's focused on the kids, but we can be more of a support that's focused on them.
And I think certainly we see relatives who come in with different fiscal resources, financial resources than a traditional foster parent. And so I think the challenges that many of our relatives are experiencing are not just about having kids in their home. It's how do they meet the day-to-day requirements of food, clothing, shelter? How do they help transport? Sometimes they've not had vehicles big enough to transport because now they've merged their children in addition to children that we're providing care for. So I think we certainly want to support all of our foster parents, but on an ongoing basis, I think we often see relatives who are more challenged with day-to-day living as a result of bringing in foster care kids or their relatives, so it increases support that's needed. Now, how that support gets delivered, I think, is between licensing and the placing worker.
So these kids, Suzanne, that go through this, you're one about third grade reading. Have we done any, or is that something we can get to with the schools on these kids that go through this trauma and how they're doing in school? And do we have any extra supports between the psychologist program we have or other things to make sure they're in school and supporting them? Because I thought at one point you had kind of talked about sometimes those are kids on the margin even then for how they're.
So when children enter foster care, placing workers have an obligation to be exploring developmental assessments. So if kids are preschool age or non-school age, looking at medical evaluations, developmental assessments to know, are they on track? And if they are not, how to access support services to help them maneuver through whatever services they need. Once they hit the educational system, workers again have responsibility to be managing and monitoring academic achievement. So it's looking at mental health evaluations. It would be looking at, are there additional educational adaptations that are needed within the schools? So that's part of that case planning process to look at the educational developmental needs of any child that enters care.
Do we track that somehow with the schools to see how we're performing there between the schools and us on keeping them going? And if they go to a relative and they have to leave the county then, they go to a different school system then, do we bring them back to their school system they're used to, or how does that
So
work?
there's federal law that would say, whenever it's determined to be in the child's best interest, we will not disrupt their school placement, but we have to like make decisions. So relative care, we know from a long-term outcome is better for kids. So if we have grandma and grandpa in Duluth, we're not gonna obviously transport them back here. Now, if they're in Minneapolis, we would then look to negotiate transportation services based on the age of the kids, if it's in their best interest, from Minneapolis back to Scott County, wherever their home district was. That's a coordination between our agency as well as the school districts. But we don't have integrated data to track that.
Other questions back here? Any from the folks that take care of these kids? Any comments, thoughts? Any adults, I should say? All right, Mr. Chair.
Okay, any questions from who's left here?
Just
Yeah,
one quick.
Commissioner Beer.
Yeah, if there was a question to say, hey, what two groups will not be at the Scott County Delivers, I'd say, probably Health and Human Services and GIS. Not expecting to see unexpected, but appreciated. So my question is, with all of the data points that this county, I guess, whether it's from the street signs or foster care homes that we generate, will that data be actionable for the groups that are served? And I have very limited knowledge of GIS. I was kind of looking for the drone here sometime today, but to make that information actionable, or where they can use it themselves, or will they need an interpreter of somebody from GIS? Because obviously you guys know that top to bottom, inside out. To make it an actionable, whether we're looking at reflectivity studies on our signs, or something as important as foster care and protective services and health and human services, to make that usable for the people that need it.
So I think that's a good question. I think it's been, Tony has had to put up with me for about the last year and a half to try to figure out where does GIS become a support to the work we're doing in children's services. Certainly, I think it becomes actionable in terms of now we have maps to show where we have providers and where we don't. So how would we look at community-based foster care recruitment, for example? How could we engage with Dakota County about a partnership that looks at how do we create efficiencies with locating placements? Other things that we've looked at within child protection, where are the children coming from that are in placement? And then we could potentially begin to build and overlook what's the risk level. So, and then the frequency of worker contact. So I think there are opportunities to look at GIS data to help us drive continuous quality improvement and activities to help improve. I think figuring out how to use the GIS data and integrate it with like the state system we have ends up getting complicated because the data's mushy. But I think there are absolutely opportunities, and I think the foster care certainly is sort of our first step.
It's exciting.
If I can jump in from a childcare perspective too, I think it's helpful from people who may want to open up their own business. If they can see what their kind of competition level is in their community, that can be helpful.
And I think, Commissioner Beer, that if you were to ask Tony, and I think Jen's question got to it a little bit, they're maintaining data. Where GIS can really help is in how they put it together and how they maintain it so it's logical for them, and then provide the applications to be able to use it. They can't pull it out of their email if it's sitting there in a in-basket. But when GIS can help them organize and put it together in a manner where they can do this, then they're maintaining it anyway. They can begin to pull it and use some of the applications and things that are built by themselves and be able to utilize it. And that has really been the goal when Gary kind of reconfigured the whole GIS, was to get them out and get them engaged in the businesses. And I think you're seeing Tony and Suzanne's commitment here to trying to get that done over the last year and understand what it is they need and try to put together things to serve them.
I mean, really turning this information, which, like I said, was kind of stored, we had it stored in the Outlook, and kind of had it stored in our heads, and all that. To have it in a centralized spot makes it portable. Like we saw, we had it up on a website, but that same site can be accessed on your phone, on your tablet, for when people are out in the field. When they're having these conversations, you can pull that information up. And, you can also edit it right there as well, so we can have this live interaction. So we're doing that throughout the county, and then we can also overlay, like we showed the school districts, we talked about with adults, access to transportation is important, finding their other needs, like what their activities are. They might want to be close to libraries, they might want to be close to parks and trails. It's kind of a holistic approach. And yeah, just having that central repository is like the first step. And we've been working very hard on kind of fine tuning it. And as we kind of showed off that data's not always as it seems. We really have to work on the data and the ways that we're displaying it to make sure it's telling the story and the narrative that we kind of need it to. So like when I displayed these maps, we might look at it and say, oh, it doesn't appear to be a problem, but when we start to dig in, that's where we really got to work with the departments and assist them. And okay, how can we get the picture?
Any other questions, comments? Oh, Claire, did I see Claire?
I just have one more. When I did a story on the JAF for the scene, they were talking about how often they get phone calls from outside agencies looking for a bed for placement for a teenager. And that's a statewide thing. And also we're dealing with the mental health issue right now. Somebody will end up in an emergency room or coming out of Anoka Hospital and they have to find a bed, and they're calling all these different facilities to see if they have openings. Something like that GIS system, if that was kept current, would really be a wonderful resource statewide for things like, juvenile placement or mental health placement. I just see so much benefit to it, and maybe we can write some programs and become the owners of them and
I think there's really good opportunity in that, Claire. I think there's also risk from the importance of recognizing the need to make placements, especially in the child world, where children are appropriately matched, so that like the work with Dakota couldn't just then place in one of our facilities. They'd really have to engage with us because we want to help screen, is that provider the best and the most equipped to parent whoever's coming in. So there's good opportunity from a partnership and regional level, but how it sort of would get played out, I think, is the place to watch.
But at least they'd know if there was a bed available.
Yes.
And then they
Correct.
could make the contact.
Yes.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.